So yesterday, the Michigan GOP had its nomination for the chair of the Republican Party in the state of Michigan. And ultimately, on the third ballot, they ended up choosing failed Secretary of State candidate Kristina Karamo to lead their party through to the 2024 election. So we're going to talk about the consequences of the nomination of Karamo to this position and what it will ultimately mean for Republicans in the state of Michigan going into 2024 and the national ramifications this will have as well. After all, Michigan is still considered by some to be a swing state, although some have sort of taken it off the map ever since the 2022 midterms. But nonetheless, this is still a state that tends to swing back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. So it is interesting that the GOP is moving in this direction, especially given the fact that their nominee was the worst performing Republican on the ballot in 2022. She lost by 14 percentage points against the incumbent Secretary of State, and has also doubled down on the fact that she thinks this election was stolen from her despite losing by 14 percentage points. So we're going to take a deeper look at this and ultimately what it means for the Michigan GOP in just a second. But of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So naturally, it's not wise to nominate somebody who lost a statewide election by 14 points in the state of Michigan to the top post in the Republican Party, but that's exactly what the Michigan GOP has done in nominating Kristina Karamo to this position. Now, what's interesting about this is that this basically cements Trump's hold on the Michigan GOP, and it kind of already was there with the former chair who was also a Trump loyalist as well. So this is sort of continuing the Trump brand after the 2020 election. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this candidate in particular was all in for Stop the Steal. And if there's anything we learned about the 2022 midterms, is that independent and swing voters are very against the message and assertions by the Stop the Steal crowd. And this sort of wing of the Trump Republicans is super unpopular in swing states, especially in places like Michigan. Again, as I mentioned, she was the worst performing Republican statewide in 2022. I mean, even Tudor Dixon only lost by 10 points, and that seems like a respectable performance compared to this. So going into the future, what exactly does this nomination mean for Michigan Republicans? Well, we can assume that Michigan's Republican Party is going to go down the path it's been going down, and that's the path of losing. If we take a look at the Michigan GOP, they've held some power in the state uninterrupted since the mid-1980s. The last time the Democrats had a trifecta in Michigan was in 1983. And now today, 40 years later, they once again have a trifecta. But that's been 40 years where Republicans have held at least one chamber of the legislature or the governorship. So despite the fact that Michigan was more of a blue state nationally, on the statewide level, Republicans were doing a lot better. Now, I think we're probably going to see the state of Michigan continue down this leftward trajectory, especially if the Michigan GOP is going to keep running candidates that are so electorally toxic to the Michigan electorate and just to swing electorates in general. And it's going to have negative consequences for the GOP at large. Again, if we pull up the House results out of Michigan, there were some crucial House seats that were in the state that were lost. Of course, we had Michigan's 3rd district with John Gibbs. He ended up losing by 13 percentage points. This was Peter Meyer's former seat. Now, obviously, it's debatable if Peter Meyer would have held on given this pitiful performance, but it is possible considering he did have a brand in his district. He was much more of a moderate Republican and sort of appealed to the sort of suburban voters that make up sort of the Grand Rapids area. But you also had Alyssa Slotkin, who ended up holding on by about 6 percentage points, despite some saying that this was going to be a vulnerable district, including myself. Again, I was very wrong about the 2022 midterms, and I'll be very open about that. But I think going forward, it certainly changed the way I analyze some of these races. And also, of course, we had Michigan's 10th, which John James did win as the Republican nominee, but he only won by about half a point, which was far beneath the expectations for him, especially being such a well-known figure in Michigan politics. But again, you could also argue this wasn't that bad of a performance considering that Tudor Dixon, I believe, lost this district by double digits in the governor's race. And again, just to pull that up, she ended up losing by 10 points. The new chair of the Michigan GOP lost by 14. So she underperformed by 4 points the top of the ticket, which is pretty bad considering in a lot of states, Republicans tend to do better down ballot. So it really was a massive rejection of this sort of stop the steal rhetoric, this sort of stolen election narrative that, again, is just really toxic with swing voters. Now, this New York Times article, which I'll link in the description down below, basically goes into the fact that these types of candidates in Michigan and across the country, while they have wide grassroots support, really fail to generate any big money support. And ultimately, to win elections in the United States, you need to have a lot of money. And all of the candidates that were running on the Republican slate in Michigan were vastly, vastly outraised by their Democratic opponents. And it's mostly because these candidates scare donors away. And lots of donors have been sort of taking a hands-off approach to these more fringe candidates, as they're basically a sure guarantee to lose anyway. But certainly the lack of funding doesn't help their position whatsoever. Now, if we take a look at some of the trends out of the state of Michigan from the midterms, and we didn't really look at Michigan specifically in my sort of 2022 analysis, I probably should make a new full autopsy video of the 2022 midterms that goes in depth with a lot of these results, because the more time I've spent kind of looking at what actually happened last November, the more I actually learn about what the midterms sort of meant and what it means for the electorate going forward in 2024. But Michigan in particular trended vastly to the left. Again, if we go back to the 2020 election, Donald Trump only lost Michigan by 2.8%, which was a far better performance than Tudor Dixon, who was somebody that was Trump endorsed, again, lost the state by over 10 percentage points. But there was a mass falling away from Republican support, not just in urban and suburban areas, the Detroit area, the Grand Rapids area, but also in rural counties just all across the state of Michigan. I'm pretty sure every single county in the state of Michigan trended left from where it was back in 2020. And that's pretty remarkable considering the fact that 2022 was billed as sort of a red wave year for the Republican Party. And really, I think the Republicans' biggest flaw was poor candidate choice. And I think candidates like Tudor Dixon, who ran campaigns that were much more akin to something a Republican would run in Alabama rather than the state of Michigan, really didn't bode well for Republicans on the rest of the ballot, and ultimately cost the Republicans at least 2 House seats they easily could have won with better candidates at the top of the ticket. But again, as we analyze these trends, most of the voters in Michigan live in these more populated areas, as with every state. Obviously, the Detroit metro area, the Grand Rapids area, and West Michigan. And West Michigan historically has been a very conservative area. Kent County, which is home to Grand Rapids, is sort of the heart of Western Michigan. And if we take a look at the results out of this county, a 6-point win for Joe Biden in 2020. Just 4 years earlier, this was a county that Trump won by about 3 points. And 4 years before that, in 2012, despite the fact that Romney overall lost the state by over 9 points, he won Kent County by 8. So despite the fact that some of the rural counties have ultimately trended much more towards the right and ultimately brought the state more towards the right, Grand Rapids and some of these more suburban counties, places like Oakland County, have been trending more toward the left. So ultimately, that's something that Republicans are going to have to contend with in the future, because the rural parts of Michigan are essentially at the point where there's only so much more vote that Republicans can squeeze out of these small rural counties. Obviously, the vast majority of the population lives in southeastern Michigan, areas around Detroit, and these are areas that are trending towards the left. They trended left in 2020, and they continue to trend pretty far to the left in 2022. Now, all of these trends certainly aren't helped by the fact that the new chairwoman of the Republican Party in Michigan wants to double down on what she calls the stolen election of 2020 and her stolen election, quote unquote, in 2022. So again, that's going to repel these moderate suburban voters that are must-wins, not just in the Sun Belt, but also in the Rust Belt. And I think that's something a lot of people on the right have neglected to understand. It's the fact that these rural counties can only get so red, and the gains have to be made in these suburban counties, or the Republicans will continue to lose in the Rust Belt. And again, the Republican path for the presidency nowadays goes through the Rust Belt. If you flip Georgia, you flip Arizona, you don't have enough electoral votes to ultimately win the election. You have to win Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania. Ideally for the Republicans, you'd want to win all 3 of them back, especially since Donald Trump showed it is possible for Republicans to win these states on the presidential level. But with this sort of direction the Republican Party is going, it's very unlikely that they're going to win the state of Michigan in 2024. And that's important because there's an open Senate seat now in the state of Michigan because Debbie Stabenow is decided not to run for re-election, and as a result opens the field up to new candidates. And I think this should be a prime opportunity for the Republicans to sort of run somebody that speaks to the voters and the values of the Republican Party, but also doesn't alienate voters in places like Kent County, which is an ancestrally Republican area, and voters in the Detroit suburbs, because again, they cannot win the state of Michigan without winning back some of these voters that ultimately ended up voting Democratic last November. So we're going to continue talking about Michigan and other states as we get closer to 2024. We're especially going to get into primary coverage for both the Republicans and the Democrats, although it looks like the Democrats aren't going to have a contested primary as of right now. But we'll still talk about what the situation could look like if they do, so stay tuned for that. Again, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.